The Sailor's Home transcriber's note: unusual and inconsistent spelling is as printed. "You seem to be weary, my friend," said Mr. Curtis, the vicar of Calm, stopping courteously to speak to a sailor, who was seated on the stump of a tree at the side of the pathway. The Sailor's Home, or, The Girdle of Truth. By A.L.O.E. authoress of the Claremont Tales, The Young Pilgrim, The Cottage by the Stream, Harry Dangerfield, Glimpses of the Unseen, etc., etc. Gall and Inglis. London, Edinburgh, 30, Paternoster Row. 6, George Street. Contents. Chapter I Coming Home 2. Speaking Out 3. Thinking It Over 4. Put to the Question v. The Lame Squirrel 6. A Storm 7. The Footprint 8. The Schoolroom Address 9. Clearing Up the Sailor's Home, or, The Girdle of Truth. Chapter I Coming Home. "You seem to be weary, my friend," said Mr. Curtis, the vicar of Calm, stopping courteously to speak to a sailor, who was seated on the stump of a tree at the side of the pathway. It was a glowing day in August, the air was hot and sultry, and dust lay thick on the road. Ned Franks, the sailor, rose on being addressed, and touched his glazed hat, on which appeared the badge of the anchor, surmounted by a crown, which showed that he had belonged to the Royal Navy. He was a fine stalwart-looking young man, scarcely 30 years of age, with sunburnt cheek, and thick curling hair, and as Mr. Curtis met the glance of his clear blue eye, the clergyman thought that he had never looked upon a face more manly or pleasant. "I've walked 20 miles, sir, since sunrise," said Franks, glancing at the bundle which he had been carrying on a stick across his shoulder, and which was now resting against the stump from which he had risen. "But I'm nigh port now, I take it, if yonder's the village of Calm." "Are you going to visit it?" asked the vicar. "I'm going to drop anchor there for good, sir," answered the tar. "I've a sister, a step-sister I should say, living yonder. She and I are all that are left of the family now, and I'll make my home with her, please God." "Surely you are too young to give up the navy, my friend. Idleness would be no blessing to a fine strong lad such as you seem to be. You may have many years before you yet of good service to the Queen." "I shall never serve the Queen again, bless her," replied the young sailor, with a touch of sadness. And Mr. Curtis then, for the first time, remarked that the left sleeve of Ned's blue jacket hung empty. "But I don't look to be idle, sir," continued Franks, in a tone more cheerful. "Bessie will have my bit of a pension for the mess and the berth, and I'll see if I can't make myself useful in some way or other, go errands, or maybe try the teaching tack. Anything would be better than lying like a log on the shore." "Teaching," repeated the clergyman. "What are you able to teach?" "Not many things," replied the sailor, with a smile. "Reading, writing, arithmetic, and not much of them neither, but I like a book when I can overhaul one, and I usually make good way with the younkers." "I well believe that," said Mr. Curtis. "I doubt not that you've many a good sea story to tell, and stirring adventure to relate. I see," he continued, "from the badge on your hat that you've served in the Queen. I dare say that you lost your arm by a Russian ball from a Sebastopol battery," and the vicar looked with interest at the young seaman, picturing him at the post of duty amidst the smoke and din of a fight. "No, sir," replied Ned, frankly, "I smashed my arm on shore, stumbling down an open cellar on a starless night." Mr. Curtis slightly raised his eyebrows, and there was a little less interest in his manner as he inquired, "And who is the sister with whom you are to live?" "Bessie Peel, sir, she's a widow in these parts." "I know her," said Mr. Curtis, rather drily. "She lives in the thatched cottage yonder, whose chimney you can just see over these trees." I hope that she may make you comfortable, he added. It's not much, sir, that I want, said the sailor, a dry berth, a wholesome mess, and a welcome. He who gets that may be thankful, whether on sea or on shore. I shall call and see you, said the clergyman, kindly, and have a little talk with you on other matters than those which concern but this passing life. I shall be heartily glad, sir, replied Ned, again touching his glazed hat. It's well to have someone to teach us how to steer twixt the rocks and the shoals. I hope that we have both the same port in view, said the clergyman. I hope so, answered Ned Franks, cheerfully, and as the vicar bade him good day, he turned in the direction of his new home. Mrs. Peel's cottage stood a little retired from the dusty high road, being divided from it by a bit of waste ground, on which some pigs were feeding. The ground was overgrown with nettles and straggling briars. The dwelling was of mud, with a roof of thatch, green with lichen and moss, under which, as under heavy overhanging brows, peeped two dots of windows like eyes. The door stood open, and within Ned caught sight of his sister engaged in washing. Mrs. Peel was a tall bony woman, with a habitual stoop, clad in a rusty black dress, with a cap which was rustier still. Broad lines of grey streaked her hair, and Ned's first feeling was that of painful surprise at the change which years had made. He did not stop, however, to dwell on the past. "Holloa, Bessie! Don't you know me?" he exclaimed, as he quickened his pace, and the next minute Mrs. Peel had run out, with her bare arms covered with soap suds, to welcome her younger brother. She was followed by a lad about 10 or 11 years of age, a sharp, wiry boy, whose pointed upturned nose, quick little black eyes, and restless manner, somehow suggested to the sailor's mind the idea of a weasel. Ned shook him heartily by the hand on hearing that this was his nephew Dan, and, with a heart glowing with pleasure at being once more in a home, the seaman entered the cottage accompanied by the Peels. "Now, Dan, you take your uncle, and show him his room, while I wring these out, and get a bit of something ready for dinner," said Bessie. "I hardly looked for you so early, Ned," she added, addressing herself to her brother. "I was up with the lark," answered the sailor. Dan, looking up with curiosity in his keen small eyes towards the stranger, whom he scarcely yet ventured to call uncle, led the way to the back of the cottage, where was a kind of garden, if a place could deserve that name, where nothing but sickly cabbages seemed to grow, with a full crop of chickweed and groundsel between. A small wood house adjoined the cottage, and over this was a little loft, to be reached by a rough sort of ladder. "We're to go up the hatchway, are we?" said Ned, mounting the ladder with a lightness and rapidity which surprised his nephew. He had to stoop his curly head low as he passed through the entrance, the door of which appeared never to have been intended to fit, since even when shut it admitted as much light as the small one-paned window of greenish glass, with a thick knob in the middle. The loft was very small, with walls unpapered, and rafters uncovered. A dirty mattress lay on the dirtier floor, and a musty scent pervaded the place. "I can't say much for the berth," thought Ned. "It's not big enough to swing a cat in, and doesn't look as if the planks had ever been holystoned. I must set things a little shipshape. Bessie, poor soul, has enough to keep her busy with her washing. I must try if I can't make my one hand do the business of two." The man-of-war seaman, accustomed to spotless cleanliness and neatness, looked around on the miserable den with a mixture of disgust and good humor. "I'll rub up the bull's-eye," he said, "and get that door to fasten with something better than a piece of old rope, and I'll try to knock up a bit of a shelf in that corner, for I've a few books in that bundle of mine. We'll soon have all right and trim as a captain's cabin." Ned Franks was to find that other things in his new home required setting to rights as well as his loft, and that there are spots and stains harder to rub out than those on his walls and floor. "Why don't you keep that garden in trimmer order?" asked the sailor, as he descended the ladder, followed by Dan. "You might grow enough of potatoes and cabbages in yon slip to supply your mother half the year." "I've not a minute's time," answered Dan, "I look after Sir Lacy Barton's cows." "Lacy Barton," repeated Ned. "Why, that's the name of one of our middies. Sir Lacy has a son in the Queen, as I've heard." "What are you saying about Sir Lacy?" asked Bessie Peel, catching the sound of the name, as her brother and Dan re-entered the kitchen. "That he has a son aboard my old vessel the Queen." "That's a piece of luck for us," cried Bessie, pausing in her occupation of cutting rashers from a fine large piece of bacon. "He's our landlord, is Sir Lacy Barton, and he's thinking of pulling down our cottage to build the new school in its place, and I'm mighty anxious to be in his favor. 'Tis a lucky chance that you've come, and can tell him all about his son." "That depends on what I've to tell," answered Ned, with a smile. "In some cases, it's least said soonest mended. I hope that none of the family will come to question me about young Mr. Barton." And the frank face of the sailor expressed more than his words, as he remembered the doings of the most worthless youth on board of the man of war. "Well, if you was asked, you'd say something pleasant, I hope," observed Bessie. "I could not say what was false," answered Ned. The words were simple enough, but the decided tone in which they were uttered, made Bessie exchange glances with her son. The boy shrugged his shoulders slightly, and something like a smile rose to the corners of his lips. The very straightforwardness of the sailor made him appear strange to those who had long mistaken cunning for wisdom, and low deceit for sharpness. Chapter 2. Speaking Out. The table was spread with food, homely but abundant, steaming bacon and greens. "A 20 miles walk must have made you ready for your dinner, Ned," said Bessie, as she seated herself at the table, and a well-filled plate was soon before each of the party. "Why, Uncle, what are you waiting for?" asked Dan, surprised that the hungry sailor did not at once begin his meal. "Bessie," said Ned, quietly, "do you say grace, or shall I?" Again mother and son exchanged glances. As no answer was given, Ned, in few words, thanked God for his mercies through Christ. This was no mere form with the weather-beaten sailor, who found himself in haven at last, after the tempest and the fight, the hardships and perils of a sea life, and was thankful to God for mercies greater than preservation through all these. "I'm afraid," said Ned, looking with a good-humored smile at his plate, "that a maimed jack-tar such as I am, must signal for assistance even at the mess." Bessie had for the moment forgotten her brother's condition. She had not realized the constant inconvenience which must follow the loss of an arm. Ned's misfortune did not, however, appear in the least to weigh down his spirits, and he chatted merrily through dinner time, talking over old days, and then making inquiries as to what hope there might be of his getting such employment as might suit a one-armed man. "I've heard as how Mr. Curtis, our vicar, is looking out for someone to help with his school," said Dan. "I think that it must have been your parson who hailed me on my course here," observed Ned. "He's rather an oldish man, bald, with a little limp in his walk," said Dan. "That's he," cried the sailor. "He talked to me friendly enough, and asked me how I had lost my arm." "And what said you?" inquired Bessie. "The truth, of course, that I was lubber enough to stumble down into a cellar at night." "Oh, Ned, he would think that you were drunk," exclaimed Bessie. "I'm afraid that he did," said Ned. "I could see in his face that I'd let myself down a peg in his good opinion." "Oh, Uncle, what a chance you lost," cried Dan, his black eyes twinkling slyly under his shock of rough hair. If I'd been you, I'd have told such a tale, how I lost that arm boarding a thundering big ship, or saving an officer's life, or doing some desperate deed. You'd have been a reg'lar hero in Calm, they'd have been getting up a subscription for you, and Mr. Curtis would have clapped you into the place of teacher at once. 'Twould have been the making of you, it would. Dan, said Ned, laying down his fork, and looking steadily at his nephew across the table, do you know what a lie is? The boy was taken aback by the sudden question, and his eyes sunk under the gaze that was fixed upon him. Receiving no answer, the sailor went on. A lie is a mean thing, a senseless, a wicked, a habitual liar is a sneak, a coward, and a fool. A fool. I don't see how you can make that out, muttered Dan, who was secretly not a little proud of his cunning, and who thought the name of fool a great deal worse than that of knave. It's easy enough to make out, said Ned, a liar is a fool as regards this life, for, look he's sure to be found out afore long, and a good character is worth more than anything that he could get in exchange for it. Is it nothing to be trusted, is it nothing to be able to look any man in the face? Dan was at the moment uneasily peering down at the crumbs on the floor. Would a man not be called a fool who should put to sea in a vessel whose timbers were all rotten, however gaily painted she might be, or however fine a figurehead she might carry? She must be stove in when the first storm came, she must soon show that she was not seaworthy. Ned had spoken with the fiery energy of one who, as he often owned, carried too much gunpowder in his cargo, but his tone softened to quiet earnestness as he went on. And if we come to speak of another world, my lad, what shall we say of the folly of lying, whatever the temptation to do so may be? Was it without reason, think you, that St. Paul, when telling how a Christian man should be armed to fight against the devil, bade him first be girt about with truth? Why, we couldn't so much as set a foot in the golden city without it. You've heard what's said in God's word of that matter, outside, shut out of glory, in company with murderers and idolaters will be whosoever loveth and make the lie. The devil himself is the father of lies, such as make them follow him, and they who choose their portion with him are fools, whatever the world may give, or whatever the world may call them. F6. 14 Revelation XXII. 15 John 8. 44 There was silence in the cottage for several minutes after Ned had ceased speaking. Dan attempted no reply, but finished his dinner in somewhat sulky reserve, then appearing suddenly to remember that he had to look after the cows, the boy rose and slunk out of the place. Dan did not, however, go in the direction of the fields, but into the village to play at pitch and toss with Tom and Jack Mullins, and to tell them wonderful stories of his sailor uncle, who was, he said, a first-rate fellow for fighting, and polished off Russians as fast as they might knock down 9 pins, but who had a ticklish temper to deal with, flaring up like fire at a word. Chapter 3. Thinking it over. You took Dan up sharp, brother, said Bessie, as her son quitted the cottage. Maybe I did, answered Ned, frankly. I'm trying to keep down that hot temper of mine, but there's nothing stirs it up like anything of deceit, and it gets in a blaze afore I'm aware. There was something in the lad's looks more than his words, that made me fancy him one of those who don't see clearly the difference between truth and falsehood, and who get amongst the shoals almost without knowing it. I wanted to show him the beacon lights set in the Bible to warn us off them, that's all. Ah! Dan's quick enough at lying, said Bessie, with a sigh. I can't believe a word that he says. Many and many's the time I tells him, Dan, with all those fine stories of yours, you'll get into trouble at last. And don't you tell him, said Ned, that God hears, and marks down, and that every idle word that men shall speak, they shall give account thereof in the day of judgment. Matt 12. 36. I'm not one of your saints that likes religion brought in at every turn, said Bessie, peevishly. 'Tis all well enough to go decently to church on Sundays, and dear me, she exclaimed, suddenly interrupting herself, and starting up from her seat. If that is not Mrs. Curtis coming over the green. That woman is always taking one unawares. And, with a quickness which astonished the sailor, Bessie whisked off the dish from the table, flung an old shawl over the large piece of bacon from which the rashers had been cut, and stowed away a heap of damp linen which she had been washing into a cupboard. She's in a mighty hurry to tidy the room for the lady, thought Ned, but it doesn't look a bit neater than before. Just as Bessie had finished her hasty preparations, Mrs. Curtis, a small, delicate lady, very simply but neatly dressed, tapped at the door of the cottage, and entered. Bessie was all smiles and curtsies. She dusted a chair and placed it for her guest, hoped that she had not been troubled by the heat of the day, and asked after the young masters and misses, like one who took an affectionate interest in the well-being of the family. I am glad to see your brother here, said Mrs. Curtis, courteously bending her head as the sailor respectfully rose at her entrance. Ah! Yes, poor fellow, exclaimed Bessie. He's my only brother living, and as long as I have a crust, he shall be welcome to share it. We must all care for one another, ma'am, as our good minister told us last Sunday in his beautiful sermon. It would be but fair, thought Ned, if Bessie gave the lady a notion that I pay for this half-crust with the whole of my pension. It's but a poor home that my brother has come to, continued Bessie, whose voice, in addressing the clergyman's wife, had a plaintive drawling tone, quite unlike that in which she usually spoke. I have been wanting much, ma'am, to speak a word or two to you or to Mr. Curtis. My husband told me that he intended to call here soon, said the lady. Ah! How glad I am even to see his blessed face. Ah! What I owe him, cried Bessie, heaving a long sigh, as if to express by it gratitude too deep for words. But what I was going to say, ma'am, was, that I hopes as how Mr. Curtis will be good enough to put me again on the widow's list for the loaves. I've really such a hard pull to live, I don't know how we can get on without it, and there was another long-drawn sigh. Ha, thought the indignant sailor. The gratitude was for favors to come. I don't see how my husband can put you on the needy widow's list, said the clergyman's quiet little wife. Your daughter is in service, your son gets work, you take in washing. Please, ma'am, begging pardon for interrupting you, said Bessie, again dropping a curtsy, the trifle Dan earns would not keep him in bread, and it's little but bread as ever we tastes, and I've not had all this blessed week more than 10pence worth of washing. And here Bessie Poole's eyes chanced to meet those of her brother, flashing on her a glance of such fiery indignation, that, quite confused, she stopped short, stammered, and could not finish what she was saying. Mrs. Curtis naturally turned to see the cause of the cottager's evident embarrassment, and was much struck by the stern countenance of the young man, who stood tightly pressing his lips together, as if to keep in some indignant burst. Finding that he had attracted notice, Ned, who had no wish to expose his sister, and who had difficulty in commanding himself, thought it safest to quit the cottage without uttering a word. Is anything the matter with your brother? Asked the lady, after Ned's abrupt departure. He has an odd temper, ma'am, very odd. I know that we shall have a good deal to put up with, but, as our good minister told us last Sunday, and the woman went on with a string of what were meant as pious phrases, but which, being only lip deep, made far less impression on her visitor than the speaker wished and intended. She talked to her son about truth, exclaimed the indignant Ned Franks, as he strode into the back garden, forgetful, in the storm of his spirit, of the 20 miles which he had walked in the morning. An acted lie is as bad as a spoken one, and her way of going on was all one wretched piece of acting from beginning to end. If there's one thing I scorn, despise, and detest more than another, it's hypocrisy like that. Ned struck the nailed heel of his boot violently against one of the weeds, and uprooted it from the ground. Perhaps he connected the worthless plant in his mind with the more hateful weed of deceit, or he wanted something on which to vent the angry feelings within him. All weeds, he muttered to himself, I've a great mind to hoist sail at once and sheer off, and find some other home where all will be open and above board, at least where there will be no hoisting of false colors, or hanging out of false lights, saying one thing and thinking another. Ned took 1 or 2 rapid turns up and down the garden, then gradually slackened his pace as his anger began to cool down. Who am I that I should judge another, thought the frank-hearted seaman. Are we not all of an evil nature, our souls as full of wickedness as this wretched garden of weeds? There's nothing good grows of itself, it's all God's grace as plants it. Am I wilful wayward sinner as I have been, am I to throw my own sister overboard, because she has not yet been led to see things as I see them, and to know that the straight course is the shortest course, and the only course that can land us in a safe haven at last? Maybe, with prayer and pains, we'll get the better both of her weeds and mine. I master my impatience and bad temper, she, and that lad of hers, learn that a lying tongue is an abomination unto the Lord, and that all who serve a God of truth must speak the truth from the heart. Proverbs 6:17. Ned took another turn up and down, stooping down now and then to pull up and throw away some straggling weed, till he found his spirit calm enough for prayer. The sailor looked up at the sky, so blue, and clear, and transparent above him, and his heart rose, in what was earnest supplication, though he could not have put it into a regular form of prayer. He wished that his deeds, and his sayings, and those of his family, might be pure, and clear, and open as heaven's sunlight, that they might be in the sight of God what they wanted to appear in the sight of men, and be honest and true in all things, like faithful servants of the Lord. Ned's meditations were broken in upon by Bessie Peel, who came running up towards him, with a bustling, excited air. "What's in the wind?" cried Ned. "You must come in directly," answered Bessie. "Who do you think is in my kitchen? I knew she'd be here, but I'm sure for Lady Barton herself to walk all the way from the hall." "What has she come for?" asked Ned, knitting his brow from an uneasy apprehension of what was likely to follow. "To hear about her son, to be sure. Lady Barton thinks no end of her son, a pretty scapegrace though he be. When he left her, she lay crying in her bed for a week. There was never a mother so fond or so blind." "But what can I say?" exclaimed Ned. "I can tell nothing good of the lad." "You must invent something good then," cried Bessie, in an irritated tone. "I can't have you, with your stupid bluntness, setting my landlord's wife against me, and getting my home pulled down over my head at Michaelmas, and my boy turned off, and my washing taken away." "I'd better not see Lady Barton," said Ned. "Shall I hurry back and say I couldn't find you? You could get over yon hedge and be off, without coming in front of the cottage." No sneaking," said the sailor, quickly. "I'll face out the matter at once." "And you'll say the best you can," cried Bessie, changing her tone and tactics with the perception that her best chance with Ned lay in working upon his affection. "You wouldn't injure your poor widowed sister, as looks to you for comfort and kindness." "I'll do no harm if I can help it," muttered the tar, feeling far more uneasy as he followed his sister than he would have done had he been led up to an enemy's battery. Chapter 4. Put to the question. Lady Barton sat in the old wooden armchair, which formed the chief article of furniture in Mrs. Peel's kitchen, the flounces of her rich blue silk dress filling up the space between the red brick fireplace and the deal table, which was still scattered over with the crumbs of the recent repast. Lady Barton was a stately and elegant woman, with an air of fashion and dignity, which contrasted with the simple attire and manner of Mrs. Curtis, with whom she was conversing before Ned and Bessie re-entered the cottage. As they came in, Lady Barton was just returning into her pocket a purse, from which she had taken a half-sovereign, with what intent both the sailor and Bessie could not but guess as they caught sight of the glittering beads of the purse as it was replaced within the silk dress. "Ah!" exclaimed Lady Barton, with a queenly graciousness of manner to the sailor, "I am glad to have an opportunity of speaking with one of the gallant men who have served in the same ship with my son. You can give me late accounts of Mr. Lacy Barton." With a bright smile on her lips, the lady awaited Ned's reply. "I was aboard the same vessel as Mr. Barton for more than a year," said the tar, with the respectful manner with which he would have spoken to any lady. "You must have seen much of him then." Ned only bowed, thinking to himself a good deal too much. As he did not seem inclined to be communicative, the partial mother tried to draw him out by an observation. "My son usually makes himself a great favorite wherever he goes." Bessie nudged her brother's arm, but Ned did not speak at the hint. Lady Barton's gloved hand closed more tightly over the little piece of gold which it hid. Rather less graciously she inquired whether Mr. Barton had been quite well when the sailor had seen him last. Ned paused for a moment before he replied. There was nothing much the matter with his health. The tender mother took alarm from his hesitation as well as his words. "Not much the matter," she anxiously repeated. "Was Mr. Barton not well? Was he obliged to keep his cabin?" "Only for a few days, lady," said Ned, sincerely desirous to relieve her. "What ailed him?" asked Lady Barton. "Was he laid up with fever?" Her voice betrayed her emotion. "No, not fever," answered the sailor, wishing himself up to his neck in water rather than standing there to answer the lady's questions. "It was not his chest, not his lungs," said the anxious mother, dropping her voice. "He was so subject to coughs as a boy." "His lungs are as sound as can be, I'll answer for that," replied Ned, with a clear recollection of the strength of a voice which, raised in an oath or a curse, might be heard above the roar of a storm. "Then what was the matter with him?" repeated Lady Barton, in the tone of one who must, and will, have a reply. Ned's honest face was suffused with a flush, as if he himself had been the culprit as he answered he'd had a bit of a spree on shore, and been knocked about a little. "These things will sometimes happen, but a few bruises don't do much harm." Lady Barton asked no more questions. She knew enough of her son's former habits to enable her to guess but too well what the sailor had left unsaid. Sorrow taking the form of mortified pride, the lady drew herself up, and the delicate kid-gloved hand slid something back into her pocket, a movement which did not escape the covetous eyes of Bessie. Without condescending to say another word to Ned Franks, Lady Barton rose from her seat, and, turning to address Mrs. Curtis, plunged at once into a different subject of conversation. She asked the vicar's wife about her scholars, said that Sir Lacy had resolved on beginning to build the new school at Michaelmas, and observed that somewhere about this spot would be the best possible place for the site. Bessie clenched her teeth, and scowled at her brother, but the expression of anger on her face was instantly changed to one of obsequious mildness, as she caught the eye of the stately Lady Barton. If Bessie had been gratified by the visit of the vicar's wife, she was overwhelmed by the honor of one from a titled lady, and with a double number of curtsies and thanks, she shooed her two guests to the door, sending blessings after them as long as they remained within hearing. And then, "You heartless good-for-nothing, unfeeling, Ill-mannered dolt, she exclaimed, turning towards her brother with a gesture of her clenched fist, as though she could have found it in her heart to have struck him, had she dared. What ill luck brought you here to bring trouble, and ill will, and ruin, on a poor lone widow as never did you any harm? I'm as vexed as you can be, Bessie, said the sailor, passing his hand through his thick curly hair. You'd better have bit off that foolish tongue of yours, than have let it provoke such a lady. It was grieving the mother, that I felt, said Ned Franks, it was seeing her so anxious and troubled. 'Twas a stiff gale to weather, and I was never in my life more nigh dragging my anchor. But I'm glad, he added to himself, I'm glad that I held fast by the truth. Ned was to have little peace during the remainder of that day. He had to endure the continual dropping that made him bitterly remember Solomon's proverb, it is better to dwell in a corner of the housetop, than with a brawling woman in a white house. *** Proverbs XXI. 9. On Dan's return home in the evening, the storm which Ned had lulled a little, broke forth anew with fresh fury. What do you think, Dan, that this hero uncle of yours has been doing? Exclaimed Bessie to her son, banging down the kettle on the bar of the grate, as if it too had grievously wronged her. Lady Barton herself, in her grand sweeping gown, came down from the hall. I'd never but once afore seen her enter my cottage, and that was when your poor father lay dying. What could she come for? Asked Dan, curiosity gleaming in his keen little eyes. What for but to hear about her son, to be sure, and to talk to this bear's cub about him, and to tip him with what would have bought me a Sunday gown, I'll be bound, for I saw the lady thrusting back her purse into her pocket. And there was he. Bessie pointed at Ned with her thumb first standing dumb as a stockfish, looking as if he couldn't utter a word, and then bounce out with such a fine tale, how Mr. Lacey had got himself smashed in a drunken row, how he had to lie in his bed for days all covered with bruises, how he was the most swaggering, quarrelsome. Ned felt the hot blood mounting to his face, and the fiery passion to his heart. There was nothing for it but to beat a retreat, before he should utter as an angry man what as a Christian he might have regretted. Weary as the sailor was, there was something which he felt to be worse than fatigue, and he walked out into the cool fresh evening air, once more to quiet his fevered spirit under the light of the pale young moon. Chapter V. The Lame Squirrel. Refreshed by a good night's rest, notwithstanding the discomforts of his new abode, Ned Franks rose on the following morning with a cheerful, thankful heart. He awoke with the verse on his lips, I bless the Lord who safe hath kept, who did protect me while I slept. Lord, grant when I from death awake, I may of endless life partake. Up sprang Ned from his rough bed, ready to forget and to forgive the breeze of the preceding day, and to set about his work in the spirit of the command, whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with all thy might. After his morning prayer, and Bible reading, Ned begun in earnest to set things ship-shape in what he called his little cabin. The loss of his left hand greatly increased the difficulty of laboring, but Ned Franks worked with a will, and therefore with good success. His only interruptions were from the little attentions required by a poor lame squirrel that the sailor had picked up on the previous evening, and which he nursed with the tenderness which seems peculiar to seamen. Ned carried it down with him when he went to breakfast in the kitchen, where he found his sister scarcely yet recovered from her fit of displeasure, but her sulkiness could not stand against the influence of his sunny good humor. "Come, Bessie, lass," cried the sailor, "let bygones be bygones, we'll have smooth water today. After I've set my cabin to rights, I'll see what's to be done in your garden. If we could only get the ground clear of weeds, it's a fine crop we might look for next year." Bessie Peel grew so gracious that she not only filled her brother's wooden bowl almost to overflowing with hot bread and milk, but she examined his squirrel with interest, prescribed for its wounded leg, and filled an old basket with hay to make a bed for the sailor's new pet. The poor little creature seemed already to know its master did not flinch from his hand, and let him warm it within his rough jacket. "One could never harm a creature that trusted one," said Ned. "I'll nurse the squirrel till its leg is all right, and then give it its freedom again. 'Twould be hard to keep it in limbo, when it might enjoy itself in the woods." Back went Ned Franks to his work, nor did he stop till he had wrought a wondrous change in the appearance of his dull little loft, by the help of a pail of whitewash which he had procured from the village. "It's beginning to look all taut and trim," said the light-hearted tar, stepping back with the big whitened brush in his hand, to survey and admire his work. "When I've earned a little more ready rhino, I'll have a bit of bunting of the Union Jack pattern over my bed, and stick a few pictures round the wall, to make the cabin quite smart. And I'll have my books up there aloft." In default of a shelf, Ned had carefully ranged along the floor what he deemed his best earthly treasures, his Bible, and such works as the Pilgrim's Progress and Saint's Rest, with a few other little books of a useful kind, from which the sailor had gleaned more knowledge than is usually possessed by one in his station of life. Ned had made such good use of his time, that before dinner he had an hour to spare for the garden. Bessie Peel, as she ironed out her linens, could hear Ned's manly voice behind the cottage singing blithely as a bird such sea songs as Poor Jack and the Arethusa. Ned Franks felt perfectly happy at his work, its very nature cheered him, for every weed that he pulled up, seemed to his mind like an emblem of some evil habit rooted out. "God is ready to give us his sunshine and his dew," thought the sailor, "but he will have us to labor all the while, and though ours be but one-handed work as it were, he'll never refuse his blessing if he knows that we're doing our best. I did ill yesterday to be so angry with Bessie and her boy, because of their sly sneaking ways, just as I looked with scorn on the dirty loft and the weedy garden. One fault mender is worth 50 fault finders, says the proverb. Maybe the great pilot has guided me hither that I may take Dan Peel in tow, and get him out of the shoals of deceit, and show him that it's better to sail with the wind of truth right in our canvas, than to lose way by tacking about, and split on the rocks at last." Dan, on coming home to the cottage for dinner, found the sailor sitting by the table, with the crippled squirrel on his knee. "Ah, I say, where did you get that?" asked the boy. "In the woods, yester evening," answered Ned. "In the woods? What woods?" inquired Bessie, turning round from the fireplace, where she was stirring something in the saucepan. "Those woods yonder, at the other side of the road," said the sailor. "Why, that's Sir Lacy's Park," exclaimed Dan. "Didn't you see the board up about trespassers being prosecuted?" "I noticed no board," answered Franks. "It was getting dark, and I minded nothing but the squirrel. As I was cruising about on the road, I saw the little creature limping on the footway. Thinks I, the village boys will hunt it to death, or 'twill fall a prey to the weasels, so I'll catch it to save its life." Easier said than done. Lame as it was, the little squirrel nearly managed to get off, squeezing itself through a hole in the fence, and so getting into the wood, or park as you call it. But I was over, and after it in a minute. "I don't know how you managed to get over, maimed as you are," observed Bessie. Ned Franks burst into a merry laugh. "A jack-tar who is used to go aloft when 'tis blowing great guns, is not likely to make much of a bit of oak fence," said he. "It was easy enough to climb over, but it was not easy to catch the squirrel. He led me a good long dance before I could clap my hand upon him." "Then he did say right," exclaimed Dan, thumping his fist on the table. "He? What do you mean?" cried the sailor, looking at the boy with surprise. "The gamekeeper did say right when he declared that he caught a glimpse of a sailor in the wood." "Likely enough," said Ned Franks, I hope that no one thinks that I was poaching." "Something worse may be thought," cried Dan, winking mysteriously, like one in the possession of an important secret. "Maybe you don't know what all the village is talking of, that just after dark, half the panes in Lady Barton's hothouse were smashed, a lot of them colored panes too, and that the constable's on the lookout to catch whoever has done the mischief." "I've heard nothing about it," said Ned Franks, as he stroked quietly the reddish-brown coat of his little squirrel. "But you're like to hear a great deal about it, a great deal more than you'd like to hear," cried Dan. "'Tis said all about that you've some bitter ill will gainst the young master aboard the Queen, and all his family too, and that you was angry at something that the lady said or did yesterday, and the gamekeeper saw you in the wood and, of course, you was there for no good, and there's not a soul as doubts as you went there and smashed the glass out of spite." "Someone has got up a fine story about me," said Ned, who more than suspected that the whole was his nephew's invention. Bessie Peel looked alarmed. I hope," she exclaimed, "that we're not a-going to get into another scrape with Lady Barton. Sir Lacy is a hard man, and never lets any one off. 'Twould be a dreadful business, Ned, if you was to be sent to prison." Franks flushed indignantly, as if the very thought were an insult, but he only said, "There's little danger of that, Bessie. I never hove in sight of the house." "How unlucky it was that you were in the park at all," began Dan, but his mother cut him short. "What's the use, you simpleton, of saying a word about the park? Who need know that your uncle was there at all?" "But the gamekeeper, what of him?" interrupted Mrs. Peel. "He only guessed that he saw something like a sailor in the dusk, and even had he seen Ned as plainly as I do now, he's only one, and there's us three, you, I, and your uncle, as can say and hold by it too, that he never stirred from that there chimney corner from sunset to midnight." "Bessie," exclaimed her brother, sternly. "You don't mean to say," cried Bessie, "that with your ridiculous notions about truth, you'll run into a trap with your eyes wide open, and get yourself disgraced, and locked up in jail? What's the use, I should like to know, of your telling the world that you were in the woods hunting a lame squirrel like a boy?" "I shall say nothing about the matter," answered Ned, "unless hist." "Hist!" exclaimed Dan, starting up. "If there ben't Sir Lacy himself, and the vicar, the constable, gamekeeper, and all. And they're coming here," he added, in alarm. "Oh, Ned, Ned," exclaimed Bessie, "whatever you do, don't own that you ever got in them woods." Chapter 6. A Storm. Ned rose from his seat on the entrance of the two gentlemen. The constable and gamekeeper remained at the door. Conscious of innocence, the sailor confronted the knight with a quiet composure which astonished his sister and Dan. Sir Lacy was a short, thickly built man, with bushy white whiskers, and white hair, round a face whose usually pink hue was now flushed to a deeper tint. His round, grey, prominent eyes, with their expression of proud domineering insolence, disagreeably reminded Ned Franks of those of the knight's namesake and son. "Your name is Ned Franks," said Sir Lacy at once, without deigning to take any notice of Mrs. Peel and her low curtsies. "At your service, sir," answered Ned. "You were trespassing in my park last evening." "No, indeed, he never left this cottage," began Bessie, but her brother silenced her by a glance. "I am sorry that I trespassed, sir," he said, respectfully. "I did not see the board, and I was after this little creature." He drew out the squirrel which, frightened by the entrance of strangers, had taken refuge within his blue jacket. "You were after something else," said Sir Lacy, roughly. "Do you mean to say that you did not wilfully smash some 20 panes in my conservatory last evening?" Ned looked steadily into the face of the rude questioner as he replied, "I was never in sight of your conservatory, sir, and as for smashing your windows, I know no more who did the mischief than Mr. Curtis himself." And as if to appeal to his sense of justice, Ned Franks turned towards the clergyman. "Perhaps you'll say that you know nothing about this," cried Sir Lacy, holding out a large leaden ball on which was roughly scratched the word Sebastopol. Ned Franks looked surprised, and, for a moment perplexed, and passed his hand through his hair, as was his wont when in any difficulty. "Can you deny that it is yours?" asked the knight. "It is mine," said the sailor, frankly. "'Tis a ball which struck me when we lay off the Crimea, but which being spent did not wound me at all, and I kept it in remembrance of a preservation from death. I lost it yesterday, I cannot tell where." "I can tell where," exclaimed Sir Lacy, in a tone that rang through the cottage, and reached the group of village boys, whom curiosity had led to follow at a little distance the steps of the knight and the constable. "I can tell where you lost it. It was picked up in my conservatory this morning, having escaped notice last night when a dozen stones were found, which, like it, had been used in breaking my glass." Ned Franks with an effort kept down his temper, and replied calmly but firmly, "How the ball came there I know not, it was certainly never thrown by my hand." "That's a falsehood," cried the furious knight. Then, indeed, the gunpowder blazed up in the breast of the young sailor, he struck his hand on the table, and, with flashing eyes, he exclaimed, "I never told a falsehood in my life, and you are the first man who ever spoke such a word of Ned Franks." Mr. Curtis laid his hand on the arm of Sir Lacy, and whispered something to him in a low, earnest tone, while Bessie stood wringing her hands, and Ned remained with his form drawn up to more than its usual height, looking as a man might look who was facing desperate odds, but with unflinching resolution. "Don't tell me," exclaimed Sir Lacy, shaking off the hand of the clergyman. "He shall go to the lock-up at once, and answer for himself before the magistrate tomorrow. The fellow shall pay for my broken glass with a couple of months in jail. Here, Masson." And at the call, the constable entered, and Ned Franks was given to him in charge. Surprise, indignation, anguish, struggled in the breast of the seaman. His first strong impulse was to knock the constable down. But even in the sudden gust of passion Ned, whose leading principle was love and faith towards God, was like a ship that still obeys the helm, even when tossed on a raging sea. "The God of truth will make my truth clear one day," Ned exclaimed, and with that appeal to one who could never be unjust, and who had himself endured the anguish of reproach and false accusation, the sharpest pang of the seaman's trial passed away. He remembered that he was drinking of his master's cup, and would submit to do so for the sake of that master. With more composure than Ned but an hour before would have believed himself capable of showing under such circumstances, for disgrace to the seaman was worse than death, he gave a few needful directions to his sister, commended his lame squirrel to her care, and bade her and Dan good-bye. "Cheer up," were the sailor's words, as he wrung Bessie's hand at parting, "the blackest cloud will blow over, and we can't be driven from our moorings while the cable of truth holds fast." Chapter 7. The Footprint. "I don't believe that he did it," said Mr. Curtis, thoughtfully, as he stood with his back to the mantelpiece in his own little study, with his hands behind him. "I am convinced that he did not," exclaimed Mrs. Curtis, from her seat by the table, where she was preparing some work for her girls' school. "And on what do you found that conviction, my love?" asked the vicar. "If the sailor had broken the windows, he would have said so at once," answered the lady. "That man could no more stoop to a falsehood than that pine she glanced out of the window could stoop to crawl on the ground like bindweed. Ned Franks has a soul above lying." You speak very positively upon a very short acquaintance, my dear, said the vicar with a smile, for he had seldom seen his gentle wife roused to give an opinion with such animation. What were you yourself just telling Henry? Did you not say that you were struck by the singular frankness with which the sailor owned that he had been trespassing in the park, and that the ball was his, and with the dignity of truth with which he asserted his innocence concerning the glass? And I also have seen him tried, and bearing the trial in a manner that would make me take the sailor's word against that of a dozen other men. Was I not by when Lady Barton questioned Frank's heart about her son? Did I not see the pain which her questions gave him? How he flushed and bit his lip, and yet from those lips an untruth could no more come than if they had been of marble. Oh, Henry, I am as sure of that young man's innocence as I am of my own. I'm afraid that we shall find it difficult to prove it, my dear. The way will be to find out who really did break the glass, said the lady. I think it very likely that the mischief was done by one of the boys of our school. Nothing more probable, said the vicar, but I see no way at present of discovering the real offender. I'll go to the park myself, exclaimed Mrs. Curtis, beginning hurriedly to put up her work. I'll search all about the spot from which the stones must have been thrown, and see if I can pick up nothing, if I can find no clue to the secret. And you, dear Henry, Mrs. Curtis laid her hand on the arm of her husband, you have a Bible class with the boys this evening, let your subject be truth. You have such a power to convince, to persuade, you may lead the culprit to confess. I fear that you hope too much, Eliza, said the vicar, shaking his head. I cannot hope too much, cried the lady, when my hope is in the mercy and justice of God, who can make all dark things light, and who will clear the guiltless. I'll go at once for my bonnet and shawl. The sun is very hot, still. Oh, never mind the heat, said Mrs. Curtis, as she hurried out of the room, first to pray for success, and then to take what other means she could to ensure it. In about an hour the gentle little lady returned, looking heated and tired, but with an eager expression on her face as she re-entered the study, where her husband was busy at his desk. Have you found anything, Eliza? He asked, glancing up from his writing. Very, very little, but something, she said, taking out of her bag a bit of whitey brown paper, roughly cut into shape. What may this be? Asked the vicar, taking it up in his fingers. It is the size, the exact size, as well as I could manage to make it out, of a footprint which I found on one spot where the ground was a little less dry than in other places. It was just about a stone's throw from the conservatory of Sir Lacy. A single footprint, exclaimed the vicar. And so faint that I passed the place thrice before I saw it all, said the lady. But two things at least were clear, there were nails in the boot which made the mark, as in those which our village boys wear, and the foot that wore it, was a good deal smaller than that of a tall man like Ned Franks. There's something in that, observed the vicar, fixing his eyes thoughtfully on the paper. But it by no means follows that the footprint was left by the person who broke the glass. Then you think the paper of no use, said the lady, in a tone of disappointment. I never said so. I trust that it may be of great use, my dear, and I thank you, not only for bringing it, but for the hint which you gave me in regard to my lecture this evening. I have been thinking over the subject. And praying, I am sure, said his wife. I, replied the vicar of Calm, we can do nothing without God's blessing, and we can do everything if it be ours. Chapter 8. The Schoolroom Address. M.R. Curtis looked unusually thoughtful and grave as he walked up the schoolroom. The boys missed the kindly smile and familiar nod, and the inquiries after sick relatives, which were wont to make his greeting resemble that of a father. All felt that the vicar had something on his mind, as he stood behind the reading desk, with the sunset glow on his bald head, looking down on the throng of boys clustering in the closely filled benches. Instead of going on with the history of St. Paul, which he had been explaining in a course of lectures, the vicar turned to the 5th chapter of Acts. Before beginning to read, with his hand on the open Bible, Mr. Curtis said a few words to the boys, who listened in the deep silence of expectation. "You see me anxious and disturbed. I am so. You all know, I doubt not, what has happened in our village today. A sailor who, after serving his country through hardships and dangers, had come here but yesterday to enjoy rest and peace in a cottage home, has been sent to the lockup, accused of an offense, which I believe from my soul that he never committed." Mr. Curtis paused, and the silence was so profound in the room, that the murmur of a little neighboring brook was distinctly heard. "My belief of his innocence," continued the vicar, "is chiefly founded on his character for truth. I believe Franks to be incapable of the meanness and sin of telling a lie. But if the sailor be innocent, some one else must be guilty, and I have chosen the history of Ananias and Sapphira for our reading this evening, that we may all learn from it how Almighty God sees, knows, and can bring to light these things that we believe to be hidden forever from the eyes of all men." Mr. Curtis then went on to read aloud the awful story recorded in the Word of God, of the man and woman whose characters had stood fair before the world, who had been counted amongst the flock of faithful Christians, but who had been struck down dead, with falsehood upon their tongues. Fearful warning to all who think lightly of the guilt of untruth. Mr. Curtis closed the Bible. "Such a history as that which I have just read," he remarked, "needs no comment of mine. We see in it written, as with letters of fire, what falsehood is in the sight of the Lord. Now, to return to the subject on which I was speaking, I wish all here to know that a clue, though a slight one, has been discovered as to the real author of the mischief done. The footprint of a boy has been left on the sod." A thrill at the words ran through the assembly, the scholars looked one at another, and then fixed their eager eyes on the speaker, gazing open-mouthed, as if they expected that the next moment his finger would be stretched forth to point out the offender. "A boy," repeated the vicar, emphatically. "Perhaps one of these now before me. A facsimile of the footprint has been carefully taken on paper, and I intend tomorrow to compare it with the boots of each one here present, unless, as I hope and trust, he who broke the glass will earn the respect and confidence of all who know him by frankly, honestly, nobly, confessing the truth at once." Again there was that kind of electric thrill through the throng, again the boys turned inquiring looks one upon another. "In such case," continued the clergyman, "I shall do everything in my power to shield that boy from the punishment which his mischievous act has deserved. I shall use my influence to procure his full pardon from Sir Lacy. But even if he have something to bear, it will be more than made up to him by the satisfaction of feeling that, in confessing, he has done what is manly and right, that he has saved an innocent man from distress, that he himself has no sudden shameful disclosure to fear, that he has earned a character for honor, the respect of his comrades, the approval of conscience, and that he has put on that girdle of truth without which whatever he may call himself, or think himself, he can be a Christian only in name." Mr. Curtis knelt down, and all the scholars followed his example. Very fervent was the vicar's prayer to God, that he might give to all present grace and courage ever to speak the truth, to conceal nothing that ought to be confessed, remembering that a great day is coming when, before assembled myriads of angels and men, the most secret things shall be manifest, when we shall know even as we are known. There was some encouragement to the clergyman in the earnest amen from the boys, which followed his prayer. "I hope that your words have made an impression, Henry," said Mrs. Curtis to her husband, as they sat together that night in the little study. The vicar had been reading aloud to his wife, but the minds of both had wandered from the book. "Why, we have no evidence beyond your little slip of paper, my love," and Mr. Curtis was interrupted by the sound of a timid ring at the doorbell. Faint as it was, both the vicar and his wife instinctively turned to listen, and nothing was said by either till the maid opened the study door with, "The glazier's little boy says that he wishes to speak with you, sir." Mrs. Curtis knew Stephen White to be one of the scholars, and her heart beat fast with expectation. "Ask him to step in here," said the vicar. A thin, sly, slouching boy soon stood at the entrance, and then, after being twice desired to come forward, moved 1 or 2 steps into the room. He hung his head, fumbled with the buttons of his jacket, and looked the picture of confusion and shyness. "I am glad to see you here, Stephen," said Mr. Curtis, encouragingly. "Speak out freely, and tell me what you have come for tonight." "Please, sir," stammered forth the boy, "you said as how you would try to get me off." Mrs. Curtis could hardly refrain from an exclamation of pleasure, as she dropped her work on her knee. "I will keep my promise to an honest, truthful boy, who, having done a wrong and a foolish action, is going to make what amends are in his power." Stephen White looked ready to cry, and put the back of his hand up to his face. "Why did you break the glass?" asked the vicar, seeing that in this case silence was clearly consent. "I thought as how it would give father a job," faintly stuttered forth the boy. "And how came you to have the ball, the leaden ball, that was found in the hothouse?" "I picked it up on the road yesterday," said Stephen, "and put it in my pocket along with the stones. I didn't think, indeed I didn't, of getting the sailor into trouble." "I do not doubt you, my boy," cried the vicar. Then, turning to his wife, he added, "Eliza, my love, just write down his words, you and I will sign the paper as witnesses, and I'll carry it myself to Sir Lacy Barton's this very night." "But oh, sir," cried Stephen in alarm, you will get me out of this scrape." "I'll do my best," answered the vicar, "and I've little doubt but that I shall succeed." Mrs. Curtis, with a hand that trembled with joyful excitement, had already dipped a pen into ink, and a clear brief statement of the whole truth was soon drawn up and signed, first by Stephen in round text, very shaky and uneven, then by the pastor and his lady as witnesses. "I am so glad," said the vicar's wife, as she brought to her husband his hat and stick, and a comforter to protect him from the night air. "I am so thankful that the character of that gallant tar is now cleared from all suspicion." "And I am as glad and thankful," said the vicar, looking at Stephen White as he spoke, "that one of my boys, resolving not to add sin unto sin, has come forward with a brave confession, and that I shall always be able henceforth to trust his honor and his word." Stephen gave a great sigh of relief. A weight was lifted off from the heart of the boy. He felt that now he could bear even the risk of being sent to prison. Chapter 9. Clearing up. "A precious scrape Uncle Ned has got himself into," exclaimed Dan on the following morning, as he blew the steam from his bowl of hot milk and bread. "He'll be had up afore the magistrate today, and then clapped into jail for I don't know how long." "If he'd only had the wit to say that he'd never entered them woods," exclaimed Bessie. "Ah! He won't be a-twitting me again for what he calls a mean thing, a senseless, a wicked. We shan't be hearing no more that a liar is a sneak, a coward, a fool." "Don't make too sure of that, my lad," cried a loud cheery voice at the door. Bessie and Dan both started up in surprise, as Mr. Curtis and the sailor entered the cottage. "Well, if ever." "Is he cleared?" exclaimed Bessie, reading an answer at once in the beaming face of her brother. "Yes, cleared, come off with flying colors," said the vicar, truth has ever the victory at last. Why, exclaimed the wondering Dan, here comes Sir Lacy himself, at this hour of the day. In bustled the knight with his flushed face and his bushy white whiskers, but looking a different man from what he had done on the previous day. Notwithstanding a violent temper, which led often to passion, and not unfrequently to injustice, there was something kindly and generous still in the character of Sir Lacy. I could not rest, he said, as to the utter amazement of the Peels, he held out his hand to the sailor, I could not rest till I had told you how much I regret yesterday's mistake. But you'll own that appearances were against you. I, sir, things looked ill, replied Ned. I should wish I should like, began the knight, half pulling a sovereign out of his waistcoat pocket, but Ned instinctively drew back, with a feeling utterly incomprehensible to Mrs. Peel and her son. No, sir, if you do me a favor, please kindly to let off the little chap who bravely spoke out the truth and cleared me. I've done that already, at the request of my good friend the vicar, said the knight. I want to do something else, my fine fellow, to show my feeling towards yourself. Then, sir, if you'd have the kindness not to send my sister here adrift at Michaelmas, she has a love for her little cabin, and is sore loath to leave it. As long as you remain here, said the knight, I give you my word that the cottage shall stand. Bessie poured out a torrent of thanks and blessings to which no one gave heed, while Ned Franks simply replied, I thank you, sir, kindly. Then, turning towards the vicar, he expressed in few but heartfelt words his gratitude towards him and his lady. Depend upon it, Ned Franks, said Mr. Curtis, a man who will not speak an untruth either for fear or for favor, is never likely to want a friend. He only can walk on the straight path freely, firmly, fearlessly, who keeps the Master's command in mind and wears the girdle of truth. The end. End of the Project Gutenberg ebook. The Sailor's Home updated editions will replace the previous one. The old editions will be renamed. Creating the works from print editions not protected by U.S. copyright law means that no one owns a United States copyright in these works, so the Foundation, and you, can copy and distribute it in the United States without permission and without paying copyright royalties. Special rules, set forth in the General Terms of Use part of this license, apply to copying and distributing Project Gutenberg trademark electronic works to protect the Project Gutenberg trademark concept and trademark. Project Gutenberg is a registered trademark, and may not be used if you charge for an ebook, except by following the terms of the trademark license, including paying royalties for use of the Project Gutenberg trademark. If you do not charge anything for copies of this ebook, complying with the trademark license is very easy. You may use this ebook for nearly any purpose such as creation of derivative works, reports, performances, and research. Project Gutenberg ebooks may be modified and printed and given away. You may do practically anything in the United States with ebooks not protected by U.S. copyright law. Redistribution is subject to the trademark license, especially commercial redistribution. Start, full license. The full Project Gutenberg license. Please read this before you distribute or use this work to protect the Project Gutenberg trademark mission of promoting the free distribution of electronic works. By using or distributing this work, or any other work associated in any way with the phrase Project Gutenberg, you agree to comply with all the terms of the full Project Gutenberg trademark license available with this file or online at www.gutenberg.org/license. Section 1. General Terms of Use and Redistributing Project Gutenberg Trademark Electronic Works 1.a. By reading or using any part of this Project Gutenberg trademark electronic work, you indicate that you have read, understand, agree to and accept all the terms of this license and intellectual property, trademark/copyright, agreement. If you do not agree to abide by all the terms of this agreement, you must cease using and return or destroy all copies of Project Gutenberg trademark electronic works in your possession. If you paid a fee for obtaining a copy of or access to a Project Gutenberg trademark electronic work and you do not agree to be bound by the terms of this agreement, you may obtain a refund from the person or entity to whom you paid the fee as set forth in paragraph 1.e.8. 1.b Project Gutenberg is a registered trademark. It may only be used on or associated in any way with an electronic work by people who agree to be bound by the terms of this agreement. There are a few things that you can do with most Project Gutenberg trademark electronic works even without complying with the full terms of this agreement. See paragraph 1.c below. There are a lot of things you can do with Project Gutenberg trademark electronic works if you follow the terms of this agreement and help preserve free future access to Project Gutenberg trademark electronic works. See paragraph 1.e below. 1.c. The Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation, the foundation or PGLOF, owns a compilation copyright in the collection of Project Gutenberg trademark electronic works. Nearly all the individual works in the collection are in the public domain in the United States. If an individual work is unprotected by copyright law in the United States and you are located in the United States, we do not claim a right to prevent you from copying, distributing, performing, displaying, or creating derivative works based on the work as long as all references to Project Gutenberg are removed. Of course, we hope that you will support the Project Gutenberg trademark mission of promoting free access to electronic works by freely sharing Project Gutenberg trademark works in compliance with the terms of this agreement for keeping the Project Gutenberg trademark name associated with the work. You can easily comply with the terms of this agreement by keeping this work in the same format with its attached full Project Gutenberg trademark license when you share it without charge with others. 1.d. The copyright laws of the place where you are located also govern what you can do with this work. Copyright laws in most countries are in a constant state of change. If you are outside the United States, check the laws of your country in addition to the terms of this agreement before downloading, copying, displaying, performing, distributing or creating derivative works based on this work or any other Project Gutenberg trademark work. The Foundation makes no representations concerning the copyright status of any work in any country other than the United States. 1.e Unless you have removed all references to Project Gutenberg, 1.e.1. The following sentence, with active links to, or other immediate access to, the full Project Gutenberg trademark license must appear prominently whenever any copy of a Project Gutenberg trademark work, any work on which the phrase Project Gutenberg appears, or with which the phrase Project Gutenberg is associated, is accessed, displayed, performed, viewed, copied or distributed. This ebook is for the use of anyone anywhere in the United States and most other parts of the world at no cost and with almost no restrictions whatsoever. You may copy it, give it away or reuse it under the terms of the Project Gutenberg license included with this ebook or online at www.gutenberg.org. If you are not located in the United States, you will have to check the laws of the country where you are located before using this ebook. 1.e.2. If an individual Project Gutenberg trademark electronic work is derived from texts not protected by U.S. copyright law, does not contain a notice indicating that it is posted with permission of the copyright holder, the work can be copied and distributed to anyone in the United States without paying any fees or charges. If you are redistributing or providing access to a work with the phrase Project Gutenberg associated with or appearing on the work, you must comply either with the requirements of paragraphs 1.e.1 through 1.e.7 or obtain permission for the use of the work and the Project Gutenberg trademark as set forth in paragraphs 1.e.8 or 1.e.9. 1.e.3. If an individual Project Gutenberg trademark electronic work is posted with the permission of the copyright holder, your use and distribution must comply with both paragraphs 1.e.1 through 1.e.7 and any additional terms imposed by the copyright holder. Additional terms will be linked to the Project Gutenberg trademark license for all works posted with the permission of the copyright holder found at the beginning of this work. 1.e.4 Do not unlink or detach or remove the full Project Gutenberg trademark license terms from this work, or any files containing a part of this work or any other work associated with Project Gutenberg trademark. 1.e.5 Do not copy, display, perform, distribute or redistribute this electronic work, or any part of this electronic work, without prominently displaying the sentence set forth in paragraph 1.e.1 with active links or immediate access to the full terms of the Project Gutenberg trademark license. 1.e.6 You may convert to and distribute this work in any binary, compressed, marked up, non-proprietary or proprietary form, including any word processing or hypertext form. However, if you provide access to or distribute copies of a Project Gutenberg trademark work in a format other than plain vanilla ASCII or other format used in the official version posted on the official Project Gutenberg trademark website, www.gutenberg.org, you must, at no additional cost, fee, or expense to the user, provide a copy, a means of exporting a copy, or a means of obtaining a copy upon request, of the work in its original plain vanilla ASCII or other form. Any alternate format must include the full Project Gutenberg trademark license as specified in paragraph 1.e.1. 1.e.7 Do not charge a fee for access to, viewing, displaying, performing, copying or distributing any Project Gutenberg trademark works unless you comply with paragraph 1.e.8 or 1.e.9. 1.e.8 You may charge a reasonable fee for copies of or providing access to or distributing Project Gutenberg trademark electronic works provided that, you pay a royalty fee of 20% of the gross profits you derive from the use of Project Gutenberg trademark works calculated using the method you already use to calculate your applicable taxes. The fee is owed to the owner of the Project Gutenberg trademark, but he has agreed to donate royalties under this paragraph to the Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation. Royalty payments must be paid within 60 days following each date on which you prepare, or are legally required to prepare, your periodic tax returns. Royalty payments should be clearly marked as such and sent to the Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation at the address specified in Section 4, Information about donations to the Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation. You provide a full refund of any money paid by a user who notifies you in writing, or by email, within 30 days of receipt that he does not agree to the terms of the full Project Gutenberg trademark license. You must require such a user to return or destroy all copies of the works possessed in a physical medium and discontinue all use of and all access to other copies of Project Gutenberg trademark works. You provide, in accordance with paragraph 1.f.3, a full refund of any money paid for a work or a replacement copy, if a defect in the electronic work is discovered and reported to you within 90 days of receipt of the work. You comply with all other terms of this agreement for free distribution of Project Gutenberg trademark works. 1.e.9 If you wish to charge a fee or distribute a Project Gutenberg trademark electronic work or group of works on different terms than are set forth in this agreement, you must obtain permission in writing from the Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation, the manager of the Project Gutenberg trademark. Contact the Foundation as set forth in Section 3 below. 1.f.1.f.1 Project Gutenberg volunteers and employees expend considerable effort to identify, do copyright research on, transcribe and proofread works not protected by U.S. copyright law in creating the Project Gutenberg trademark collection. Despite these efforts, Project Gutenberg trademark electronic works, and the medium on which they may be stored, may contain defects, such as, but not limited to, incomplete, inaccurate or corrupt data, transcription errors, a copyright or other intellectual property infringement, a defective or damaged disk or other medium, a computer virus, or computer codes that damage or cannot be read by your equipment. 1.f.2 Limited warranty, disclaimer of damages, except for the right of replacement or refund described in paragraph 1.f.3, the Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation, the owner of the Project Gutenberg trademark, and any other party distributing a Project Gutenberg trademark electronic work under this agreement, disclaim all liability to you for damages, costs, and expenses, including legal fees. You agree that you have no remedies for negligence, strict liability, breach of warranty or breach of contract except those provided in paragraph 1.f.3. You agree that the foundation, the trademark owner, and any distributor under this agreement will not be liable to you for actual, direct, indirect, consequential, punitive, or incidental damages even if you give notice of the possibility of such damage. 1.f.3 Limited right of replacement or refund. If you discover a defect in this electronic work within 90 days of receiving it, you can receive a refund of the money, if any, you paid for it by sending a written explanation to the person you received the work from. If you received the work on a physical medium, you must return the medium with your written explanation. The person or entity that provided you with the defective work may elect to provide a replacement copy in lieu of a refund. If you received the work electronically, the person or entity providing it to you may choose to give you a second opportunity to receive the work electronically in lieu of a refund. If the second copy is also defective, you may demand a refund in writing without further opportunities to fix the problem. 1.f.4 Except for the limited right of replacement or refund set forth in paragraph 1.f.3, this work is provided to you as is, with no other warranties of any kind, express or implied, including but not limited to warranties of merchantability or fitness for any purpose. 1.f.5 Some states do not allow disclaimers of certain implied warranties or the exclusion or limitation of certain types of damages. If any disclaimer or limitation set forth in this agreement violates the law of the state applicable to this agreement, the agreement shall be interpreted to make the maximum disclaimer or limitation permitted by the applicable state law. The invalidity or unenforceability of any provision of this agreement shall not void the remaining provisions. 1.f.6 Indemnity. You agree to indemnify and hold the foundation, the trademark owner, any agent or employee of the foundation, anyone providing copies of Project Gutenberg trademark electronic works in accordance with this agreement, and any volunteers associated with the production, promotion, and distribution of Project Gutenberg trademark electronic works, harmless from all liability, costs, and expenses, including legal fees, that arise directly or indirectly from any of the following which you do or cause to occur. A. Distribution of this or any Project Gutenberg trademark work. B. Alteration, modification, or additions or deletions to any Project Gutenberg trademark work, and C. Any defect you cause. Section 2. Information about the mission of Project Gutenberg trademark. Project Gutenberg trademark is synonymous with the free distribution of electronic works in formats readable by the widest variety of computers including obsolete, old, middle-aged, and new computers. It exists because of the efforts of hundreds of volunteers and donations from people in all walks of life. Volunteers and financial support to provide volunteers with the assistance they need are critical to reaching Project Gutenberg trademark's goals and ensuring that the Project Gutenberg trademark collection will remain freely available for generations to come. In 2001, the Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation was created to provide a secure and permanent future for Project Gutenberg trademark and future generations. To learn more about the Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation and how your efforts and donations can help, see sections 3 and 4 and the Foundation information page at www.gutenberg.org. Section 3. Information about the Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation. The Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation is a non-profit 501(c)(3) educational corporation organized under the laws of the state of Mississippi and granted tax-exempt status by the Internal Revenue Service. The Foundation's IN or federal tax identification number is 64-6221541. Contributions to the Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation are tax-deductible to the full extent permitted by U.S. federal laws and your state's laws. The Foundation's business office is located at 809 North 1500 West, Salt Lake City, Utah 84116801596-1887. Email contact links and up-to-date contact information can be found at the Foundation's website and official page at www.gutenberg.org/contact section 4. Information about donations to the Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation. Project Gutenberg trademark depends upon and cannot survive without widespread public support and donations to carry out its mission of increasing the number of public domain and licensed works that can be freely distributed in machine-readable form accessible by the widest array of equipment including outdated equipment. Many small donations, $1 to $5,000, are particularly important to maintaining tax-exempt status with the IRS. The Foundation is committed to complying with the laws regulating charities and charitable donations in all 50 states of the United States. Compliance requirements are not uniform and it takes a considerable effort, much paperwork, and many fees to meet and keep up with these requirements. We do not solicit donations in locations where we have not received written confirmation of compliance. To send donations or determine the status of compliance for any particular state, visit www.gutenberg.org/donate. While we cannot and do not solicit contributions from states where we have not met the solicitation requirements, we know of no prohibition against accepting unsolicited donations from donors in such states who approach us with offers to donate. International donations are gratefully accepted, but we cannot make any statements concerning tax treatment of donations received from outside the United States. U.S. laws alone swamp our small staff. Please check the Project Gutenberg web pages for current donation methods and addresses. Donations are accepted in a number of other ways including checks, online payments, and credit card donations. To donate, please visit www.gutenberg.org/donate. Section 5. General information about Project Gutenberg trademark electronic works. Professor Michael S. Hart was the originator of the Project Gutenberg trademark concept of a library of electronic works that could be freely shared with anyone. For 40 years, he produced and distributed Project Gutenberg trademark ebooks with only a loose network of volunteer support. Project Gutenberg trademark ebooks are often created from several printed editions, all of which are confirmed as not protected by copyright in the U.S. unless a copyright notice is included. Thus, we do not necessarily keep ebooks in compliance with any particular paper edition. Most people start at our website, which has the main PG search facility, www.gutenberg.org. This website includes information about Project Gutenberg trademark, including how to make donations to the Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation, how to help produce our new ebooks, and how to subscribe to our email newsletter to hear about new ebooks. The Sailor's Home, Chapter I, Chapter 2, Chapter 3, Chapter 4, Chapter V, Chapter 6, Chapter 7, Chapter 8, Chapter 9. The full Project Gutenberg license.